Good evening and welcome again to Sharia Crime Stoppers. As you know, we're proud to be part of the United West, and we had a busy week last week, and we're going to be continuing with our Tuesday webinars. At the United West, we talk about one team, one fight. We really want to be specific. We're talking about the 2020 fight, and we'll talk more about that. We're here every Tuesday night, and we appreciate your being with us. We've had a significant growth in interest over the last 7 days. Tonight, we have the opportunity with you to celebrate Constitution Day. As Mary reminded me, it was 232 years ago today that the brave people actually came together and signed the Constitution. A great way to celebrate the Constitution is to be concerned about the assault on the Constitution, specifically from Islam. And we can't think of a better person to have on that topic than Shahram Hadian, Pastor Hadian. Good evening. Thank you for being with us.
Great to be back with you, Dick and Mary, and thanks for having me back. Feels like it's been a while, hasn't it? Or was that just last week?
Been a long time.
Long time.
Long time. And lots of things have happened in the meantime. It is Constitution Day. Let's take a deep breath and try to remember what a remarkable, exceptional document we have. How blessed are we that these grandparents we talk about got on the boat and came over here to participate maybe 100 years ago in this experiment with freedom and to be living under the Constitution. And we get to wake up every day and have the freedoms that we have and that Shahram's going to talk about. And Mary's going to be with us as well, commenting as well as dealing with your questions. Let's talk about the mechanics a little bit. For those of you that may not remember, at the bottom of your screen, you have a Q&A button. When you click on that, you'll be able to enter a question. We really want to ask you to please make your questions brief and to the point. We had so many questions last week. Mary does a lot of things really well, but it's a little challenging if you write a paragraph or two before your question. So please be brief. To be honest with you, if you write a brief question, it'll probably get picked up. If you write a long, lengthy one, it might not, just because of the logistics of what we're trying to accomplish here. So tonight we basically have part one of the topic. So Shahram, as I remember, you've got three parts to this topic: Islam's assault on the Constitution. They're all three part of the Till Project, right?
Did correct. So there's actually two things. One is that we have the three-part series that is on our YouTube channel. So if I guess they can get to it from your guys' page if you have the link, or they can get it also from our Till Project website, and just under the media tab, they can get to our YouTube page, or just go to YouTube, I guess, and just type Till Project. And so we have part one, part two, part three. Also, we do have a DVD of this Islam's assault on the U.S. Constitution, also available on our website as well, which has more content than I was able to cover in those three-part things. So it's sort of a supplementary as well if they want to get a copy of that at some point. Just go to our website.
Again, TIL stands for Truth in Love.
Absolutely. That's the mission, our calling from the book of Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, that we are commanded to speak the truth in love in order to make sure that we help mature. Well, first of all, truth is important because there's a full-on assault against truth and against truth sayers. That's why your program and others we're always under attack, as we talked about last week, but also because as Christians, we're called to speak the truth in love so that we can mature as Christians. We can mature to the stature of Christ and not be like little children who are then tossed about by deception. And certainly when it comes to this issue today, as we're celebrating Constitution Day, guys, there's a lot of deception about whether Islam, and particularly Sharia law, is an assault. So I know we're going to be talking about that, and I cover a little bit of that in part one that they're going to watch here.
So part one is a recording, one of the three recordings. You can access all three as we just discussed. We're going to show you part one because we think it's a firm foundation. Then Shahram will be continuing with us live. We'll cover the content of part two and part three interactively with Shahram, and you'll be able to ask your questions. So we're going to take about a 28-minute period now and look at part one, and then come back live with Shahram for part two and three and your questions. So Mary, if you would get us going on the video.
Sure. One quick, Shahram, just tell everybody what your website is so that they have it before we get started.
Absolutely. Again, it's tilproject.com, TIL for truth and love, then the word project.com.
Excellent. Okay, one moment and I'll get it started here.
Well, welcome to Till Project TV with Pastor Shahram Hadian. It's great to have you with us again on the program. Today, we're going to take things in a little different direction here. As you know, and many of you know, or if you're new to the programs here, my name, Pastor Shahram Hadian. I'm originally from Iran. I was born in Iran, and I left Iran in 1978 before the fall of the revolution there. I became a Christian 18 years ago. I was born into a Muslim family, raised as a Muslim, converted to Christianity in 1999, been a Christian for over 18 years now, and by the grace of God, growing and becoming a pastor and so forth and so on, all those things. But one of the things that the Lord has allowed us to do in our ministry is to travel around and speak on my background as a former Muslim, but also to warn people about the dangers of Islam, what Islam is ideologically, spiritually, practically, what their legal system is, the Sharia. And that's where I want to take our program today. We're going to have this program and potentially one or two more on Islam's assault on the U.S. Constitution. Those of us who live in America, we live in Western society. Oftentimes our laws are based on Judeo-Christian values. And in those Judeo-Christian values, there are certain things that are enshrined that we're going to cover today that I think we'll clearly see, and anybody who's been following Islamic law or the Sharia will see that Sharia is antithetical, the opposite of those values. And in order to understand the antithetical nature, we have to first understand our values. So again, we're going to kind of dive into this today, potentially one or two other shows on this, because it's a very, very important topic. And I would encourage that if you know those who are in law enforcement or who are elected officials, especially, this is a program they want to see. These programs are critical because this is not just a spiritual issue, it is a legal issue. And my background, not only as a pastor, but I was a police officer in the city of Redmond, Washington. I've run for office. I ran for governor in the state of Washington in 2012, actually for office in 2010. I have many friends who are legislators, county commissioners, city council members. So I brief people in law enforcement and people, elected officials, all the time on the issues of Islam. And this is the number one kind of issue that is arising, is a greater understanding of what Sharia law is and how it violates our Constitution. So I want to dig into starting with the principles of our Constitution and our Declaration, our Bill of Rights. It's interesting that as a person who was not born in this country, but I became a citizen here of America in 2007. I've been a citizen now for 10 years. I find a lot of Americans don't know their founding principles. They don't know what our founding or the foundation of our government is supposed to be as a constitutional republic. So some of the values that are enshrined, we're going to go through this. And I want to start with the Declaration, because oftentimes people cover the Constitution, but they don't cover the Declaration. The Declaration establishes what's called natural law. If you know the first paragraph of our Declaration, it talks about the laws of nature and of nature's God. Well, according to the founders, they understood this to be natural law, the laws of nature, the laws that are found in nature, creation, laws that God would have created, and the laws of nature's God, being many founders, not all, of course there were many deists among the founders, but many of the founders understood that to be scriptural law. That's why we see the Ten Commandments oftentimes spoken of in our foundation, quoted by the founders, quoted by the courts. In fact, it was not until the 1950s that the Ten Commandments were removed from a foundation of our law. Before then, the courts would routinely rule that the ethics of the Ten Commandments were foundational to a free society. So the Declaration establishes a few different things here. Number one, it establishes natural law, that the laws of nature, nature's God, cannot be violated without consequence. The Declaration also establishes what's called separate and equal stations, the idea of separation of powers. You separate powers in order to be able to make sure that power remains close to the people so that you don't have tyrants or tyranny or despotism building up. Then we have equal protection under the law and equal rights under the law. Again, this is part of natural law. The Declaration says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So this equality comes really from a biblical concept that men are created equal, that God has created us equal, that we're made in His image, and therefore every person should have protection of their rights in regards to what God has granted. I'm not talking about government man-made rights, but what God has protected. Also, the Declaration understood that the rights come from our Creator, not from man. Specifically, that we are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By the way, the word unalienable, I'm saying that accurately, not inalienable, but unalienable, meant that if God grants certain rights, like life, the right of life, government can never take those rights and cannot put a lien against those rights. That's why it was unalienable. So if God has granted the right of life, the right of religious worship, government can never take those rights away or infringe upon those rights unless they're violating the higher laws, the laws of God. So these are some of the principles of the Declaration. We have natural law. We are created in the image of God, created equally, equal protection, equal rights, and of course, those rights cannot be taken away unless we infringe upon God's laws with consequences. Now, in the Constitution, we have certain rights that are also enshrined in there. For example, we have the fact that just powers, and this is interesting because this is actually the idea of just powers comes from both the Declaration and the Constitution, the idea that the power is given by men, the consent of the governed. The terminology there is consent of the governed. The consent of the governed, the people who are being governed give consent for establishing a civil government. Now, we understand as Christians that civil authority is biblical as long as that civil authority is honoring the very laws of God. That unless the only time we'd be allowed to violate or disobey civil authority, as many examples we see in the Bible. For example, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We see the example of Esther. We see the example of the maidens when they disobeyed Pharaoh, when they wouldn't kill the firstborn of Egypt. On and on and on. We see many examples of people in the Bible who had to disobey civil authority. The example of Peter in Acts, we must obey God rather than man. This is the example of the violation is only justified if the civil authority is violating the laws of God and the higher laws. So this is a foundational principle of our form of government, at least was supposed to be. And the consent for us to be under that, or for us to be governed by that, I should say, is given by consent, meaning that we have to give our consent to be governed under that formation. If that formation or that civil authority is now violating foundational beliefs, the rights that are given, the laws of nature, nature's God, then we're supposed to remove our consent, theoretically speaking, because that never happens, but that's what we're supposed to be doing. In the Constitution, Article 6 of the Constitution establishes the supremacy that the Constitution is the law of the land, meaning that for us here in America, if we're to be subject to the civil authority in honoring God, if the Constitution is that civil authority, or is the foundation of the civil authority, I should say, therefore we should be submitted to the Constitution unless the Constitution violates the laws of God. So again, we have this hierarchy, this aspect that God is the highest authority, then actually the church has authority above the civil authority, meaning that in matters that are ecclesiastical. So the church is not subject to the government in matters that are ecclesiastical, in matters that are ministerial. We don't obey the government. We don't have to follow their decrees, like, for example, the Johnson Amendment, the 501c3. and other things that would force us to violate our faith. That's why Christians are in a conundrum today with obeying things like homosexual marriage, abortion laws, funding those things, the transgender bathrooms, and so forth and so on. So Article 6 of the Constitution states that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and is to be followed not just by the people, but by the judges, by the legislators, by the branches of government. Now, we're going to break down some of the amendments here real quick before we get into how Islamic law violates it. But again, the reason I'm spending so much time on this, I've spent probably about 10 minutes on this now, is because for us to understand how Islam is antithetical, we have to understand how or what our foundation is. By the way, I wanted to mention that the presentation or this message that I'm doing today, and we'll do it in one or two other shows, is actually on DVD. We have the DVD available, Islam's Assault on the U.S. Constitution, Will America Surrender or Survive? This is a battle that we're seeing in many Western nations. We see this battle in Europe, we see this battle in Canada, we see this battle in Australia. Many European nations, Western nations, they've had some basis for their governments based on Judeo-Christian values, are now in a fight against the Islamization, against the imposition of what is Sharia law. So I encourage you, if you're able to go to our website at tillproject.com, get a copy, get multiple copies, send it to your legislators, send it to your elected officials, send it to your county commissioners, maybe to law enforcement. They need to understand what we're talking about. And the purpose of me making this was very much to make a legal argument as one who has been in law enforcement, as one who has run for office and has friends in the legislature, understands to some extent the lawmaking process. So very important. And again, I'll mention some other highlights. Actually, one of the other ones that we have, a colleague of mine, Dr. Bill Warner, has this great book called Sharia Law for Non-Muslims. It's not promoting Sharia law, it's exposing it, and this is also available on our website at tillproject.com. These are available, by the way, for donations on our website, suggested donations, and it's helpful for us to continue to get these messages out. And this is a really good booklet for if you have friends who are like, well, what's the big deal you're making about Sharia law? It's no big deal. Linda Sarsour, some of you may know who Linda Sarsour is. She recently called for, at an ISNA conference, a Muslim Brotherhood conference, she called for jihad against President Trump and called for Muslims to not assimilate into our country and to obey Allah only. Linda Sarsour, who is very pro-Sharia, she claims that Sharia is just, we observe not eating pork and drinking alcohol and praying 5 times a day. That's nonsense. Sharia is way more than just that, and we're going to show you here in a few minutes and on subsequent shows. So again, we have lots of resources, lots of DVDs that I'll be talking about, but I really encourage you, if you can, to get this Islam's Assault on the Constitution, because it is really paramount for people to understand. Now, quickly, I'm going to go through some of the other aspects of the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Bill of Rights is the amendments, first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Okay, so we see the fact here that the First Amendment is what? A freedom of religion, conscience, speech, press, etc. The Bill of Rights, that is, again, the amendment to the Constitution, enshrines these rights that are to be untouched, unalienable or inalienable, but to be untouched. So the First Amendment, we have the freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. Second Amendment, right to bear arms and self-defense. Fifth Amendment, the right of indictment of a grand jury for capital crimes, infamous crimes. There's a reason I'm covering that one, because our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, guarantees that we have a right to go before a jury and a grand jury if we are facing a capital offense. Fifth Amendment also says that there should be no deprivation of life, liberty, or property without without due process of law. So very, very important. Sixth and Seventh Amendments are dealing with right of a trial, right of speedy trial, right of public trials, right of a jury trial. And by the way, this is the Seventh Amendment, which is common law. It's specified in the Seventh Amendment. The Eighth Amendment, no cruel or unusual punishments. The 11th Amendment, can't be prosecuted by foreign states or foreign laws. That's actually in the 11th Amendment, that we're not supposed to have any application of foreign law or foreign states, including United Nations laws, decrees, treaties. All those things are never supposed to violate our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. 13th Amendment, Section 1, there's no slavery or involuntary servitude. There's not supposed to be the promotion of slavery. 14th Amendment, Section 1, equal protection under the law. Again, this is adjoining what is in the Declaration. 15th Amendment, Section 1, the right of blacks and slaves to vote. The 19th Amendment, the right of women to vote. And we can go on and on. So the fact is that the principles enshrined in our Declaration and Constitution and Bill of Rights, this is what we live with, folks. Whether you like it or not, that's our foundation here in this nation. When I came to America, I became a citizen. I took an oath to defend those principles. When I was a police officer, I took an oath to defend those principles. People who've served in our military, I thank you for your service. You took an oath to defend those principles. If there are people in this nation like Linda Sarsour who don't want to live by those laws, who don't want to live by those principles, who want to impose Sharia law on us, listen, I have one piece of advice for you. You can take your values and go somewhere else in the world. We'd be more than happy to take up a fund. We'll make a GoFund page for you. We'll get you some plane tickets, and we'll send you to any nation in the world that lives by Sharia law. I heard Iran is really nice these days. I heard Saudi Arabia is great. Pakistan, Indonesia, Egypt, Turkey. Why don't you go to one of those places? But if you come to this nation, the presumption is that we will assimilate and accept and live under these laws. Because if we're going to honor God, I'm amazed the number of Christians that I hear and Christian pastors who they think that, it's good to honor God when it suits their need, or to honor our civil authority, but when it doesn't suit their needs, now all of a sudden they don't want to do it. Well, listen, I've given you the parameter. The only reason that we have to not follow our civil authority is if and when that civil authority violates the very laws of God, the very teachings of the Bible and our faith. That's the only scenario. Other than that, we're supposed to actually be able to honor these things and follow them. So if there's people who come here who won't follow them, who want to impose their own system, by the way, a system that you'll see wants to overthrow our form of government, our form of life. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood says in their explanatory memorandum. Therefore, they either need to assimilate or go back home. And the same is true for all these refugees that are coming in. Now, let's start with aspects of Islamic law that violate our Constitution, and then we're going to again pick up more of this in the next show. I'm going to be quoting today from Islamic sources. I'm going to be quoting from the Quran, the so-called holy book of Islam. I'm going to be quoting from the Sunnah, which is the Hadith and the Sirah, which are the sayings and actions and biography of the Prophet of Islam, since he's the only person who claims to have revelation and was the witness to the revelation of Islam. There are no other witnesses to the revelation of Islam. He's the only one source. The Sunnah is his practice. In fact, the word Sunnah means practice in Arabic, and this is the practice of Muhammad. So when Muslims are trying to figure out what they should do, they want to follow Muhammad. And then finally, we'll be quoting a book that I've used before called The Reliance of the Traveller. This is a handbook for Muslims when they're wherever they are in the world. That's why it's called Reliance of the Traveller. Wherever they are in the world, wherever they're traveling, wherever they're living, it's a guidebook for them to know how to follow Islamic law, how to follow the teachings of Muhammad and the teachings of their God Allah, so that they don't violate their scriptures, they don't violate their precepts. And the Sharia law book, if people who want to be able to say, well, is this really a credible book? What if, there's a lot of people that say, well, you can't ever ascribe a consistent Islam. There's too many different views in Islam. Well, yes, there are people who have different views, just like in Christianity. But the question is there an orthodox Islam? Well, according to the Sharia law book, The Reliance of the Traveller, there is an orthodox Islam. In fact, this book says, and it's certified by various Islamic scholars, and it says here certified by Al-Azhar University, which is in Cairo, Egypt, the most premier Islamic school in the world. it says here that there was a request that was submitted concerning the examination of the English translation of the book Umdat al-Salik wa Udat al-Nasik. This book here by Ahmad ibn Naqib, and this is in the Shafi school of jurisprudence. Shafi is one of the 4 schools of Sunni Islam. Sunnis are the largest Muslim group. Over 83% of the world's 1.7 billion Muslims are Sunni. And Shafi is one of the schools. It is one that is not liberal but more conservative. But again, they're going to say here, you'll see in a minute, that the writings and the law that is within this book is consistent with Sunni Islam. Together, it says, with appendices by Islamic scholars on matters of Islamic law, tenets of faith, and personal ethics and character. Now, here we go. We certify that the above-mentioned translation corresponds to the Arabic original and conforms to the practice and faith of the, what? Orthodox Sunni community. Okay, there you have it. So the Orthodox Sunni community, over 83% of the world's Muslim population, have no problem following this. There's no objection to printing and circulating it. So not only is it an accepted Islamic translation, it's an accepted English Islamic translation for Muslims around the world who don't speak Arabic, because that's the majority. Majority of the world's Muslim population don't speak Arabic. So this is certified. And we're going to be quoting from multiple times from this book, because not only from the Quran, not only from the Sunnah, but this book, because it is Islamic law. It is a compilation of over 1,000 years of case law by various Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh councils, rulings, clerics, giving all this document, this book. Now, let's start with the first area of contradiction. How is Islam antagonistic to the principles that I've described today from the Declaration, Constitution, and Bill of Rights? Let's start with women's rights, because remember we talked about that we in this nation are supposed to have equal protection under the law, equal rights under the law. We now have women that can vote, that have equal rights, so forth and so on. That's the premise. Okay, number one, we're going to look at what Islam teaches about women and what is permissible for women. We're going to go to Surah chapter 4. By the way, the likes of Linda Sarsour. Linda Sarsour doesn't surprise me. A pro-Sharia advocate who claims that Islam is tolerant towards women doesn't surprise me. That's pretty standard for one of the ways that they deceive the West. What's surprising is the fact that she's claiming me to be a feminist, and really she's a fake feminist. And what's more surprising is all the feminists that stand with her. The likes of Madonna and Ashley Judd and Linda Sarsour, by the way, if you don't know who she is, was one of the major organizers of the Women's March after President Trump took office back in January 2017. And she organized the Women's March. She had all these feminists marching with her, wearing, I don't know if you saw these pictures, but they were wearing pictures of women in a hijab of the American flag, saying that this is somehow Islam liberates women. Like crazy. Who are they talking to? It's a bold lie, and it's absolute foolishness. In fact, these feminists who are joining forces with the likes of Linda Sarsour, they are using the historical term useful idiots. They're being used as fools, as tools of the Islamic agenda in the West. So let's talk about women's rights. In Surah chapter 4, the question has come up of how to deal with a woman who is maybe being insubordinate to her husband. It says, men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them. Then, if they persist, forsake them in bed. Don't sleep with them, don't have intimate relations with them. And finally, strike them, hit them. But if they obey you, then seek no means against them. So if they obey, leave them alone. So here in the Quran, Allah very clearly says, the God of Islam, in Surah chapter 4:34, that it is permissible for a man who has ownership over his wife to
1, forsake her, ignore her. 2, forsake her in bed, which maybe some of the women are thinking, well, that's no big deal. And number 3, hit them. Oh, that's the problem we have. We have a problem with that one, don't we? We have a problem with that one. So this section in the Quran is very important to understand, because this is a foundational understanding of how women are to be treated in Islam. So all these people that say, well, women, they're liberated and they're protected is nonsense, because this is an aspect of men being superior. This is also affirmed in Surah 2228 and Surah 4128, that the aspect of striking a woman is permissible if they're rebellious. Now, you may have a problem with that because that's against the law. It's called assault. Let me keep going here. Sahih Bukhari 762-132. The Prophet, this is Muhammad talking now. The Prophet said, "None of you should flog his wife as he flogs a slave and then have relations with her." What? So none of you should hit your wife as you would hit your slave and then expect her to be in the mood. That's basically what he's saying. This is Muhammad speaking according to Sahih Bukhari. Sahih Bukhari is the most quoted sunnah. The Sahih means it's authenticated back to the words of Muhammad according to them. It's the most authenticated sunnah, Bukhari, the hadith, in section 762-132. That same section goes on to say, in regards to a question, that most of those in hell will be women. Most of those in hell will be women. Isn't that wonderful, ladies? So don't hit your wife and then expect her to be in the mood. It doesn't say don't hit your wife, period. It says don't hit your wife and expect her to be in the mood. Here's another Bukhari. The Prophet said, "Isn't the witness of a woman equal to half that of a man?" What? The Prophet Muhammad said that the witness, the legal witness of a woman in law, in court, is equal to half that of a man. What happened to equal protection under the law? The woman said yes. So he's asking a question of some woman. She says yes. He says, well, let me tell you why. This is because of the deficiency of a woman's mind. So the reason that the woman's testimony is half that of a man in court, in Islamic law, is because her mind is deficient. Isn't that lovely, ladies? This is in Sahih Bukhari 348-826. Again, authenticated back to what Muhammad said. This can't be refuted, by the way. I don't care what Muslims tell you about how wonderful and tolerant Islam is. This cannot be refuted. So this is not only, these things that I just read, is not only a violation of natural law, it's a violation of the equal protections under the law, clauses that are in our Declaration and Constitution and Bill of Rights. So how is it that Islamic law, the treatment of women, can be compatible with our Constitution? It's not. It's impossible. And this is the problem we're going to have moving forward, folks. As we see more Muslims pouring into our communities, being shoved down our throats by the liberals and the elites and the socialists and the Marxists. Again, we see this ongoing Marxist Islamic access. The more we're going to have, like what's going on in Europe, Sharia courts established, Muslim enclaves, demanding Sharia. We already see it happening. I'm going to be, I've traveled through parts of the country in places like Minnesota, where you have large Somali populations, large Muslim populations. The fact is, folks, we have a problem. So we got to go today. We got to stop here. We're going to come back in our next program, pick this up, join us again. But we have to address this problem seriously. Talk to your legislators, talk to your elected officials. They cannot hide from this. This is not going away. So join us there. Also go to our website again, tillproject.com, Get a copy of this DVD. Share it with anybody that you know, political groups, civic groups, churches, elected officials. They need to know what's going on. Blessings to you. We appreciate being with us today. We're grateful for the opportunity to be here with you. And God bless you, and we'll see you next week.
We're back, Mary, and I think Shahram will be with us momentarily. Just a quick footnote: that was World View Weekend as a part of the platform and the delivery of the video. Shahram, welcome back. We get to see you live, and we appreciate the introduction you just gave us. It's really, really important. Again, we are Sharia crime stoppers, so this is precisely our message, our concern that big crimes, little crimes, all kind of crimes. The other key message is one of the reasons we do this and we have people like Shahram on is because this is part of the purge. The conversation we're having tonight is not available to the employees of the federal government or the military or your sheriff or your local. Of course, we have our own training that's provided by David Boris, but this is not readily available, this information. So let's, Mary, unless you've got a comment or a question you think we need to dive in, why don't we just keep going?
Yeah, I do have a quick question. In this first video, Shahram, you talk about how you actually speak to a lot of legislators. I'm curious to hear what kind of reaction you get from them. You are so detailed in the message of the Constitution and how Sharia is against it. Are they open to realizing that Sharia is as bad as it is and dangerous for this country? Or they pretty much push you away?
Well, Mary, that's a great question. I think it depends on the particular legislators. I mean, certainly I've had no positive response from anybody on the Democratic side. There are some conservative legislators around the country that I've talked with in various states who are concerned. And it's a hit and miss, but the challenge is, and for example, for about 4 years now, we've been working with legislators in Idaho, the neighboring state to mine here. I'm in Washington State. And we've been trying to push the American Laws for American Court bill that simply says, and as you guys remember, when the state of Oklahoma, going back to, right, I want to say 2010, 11, I think it was, maybe 12, when they passed the law actually outlawing Sharia law,
right,
it was a overwhelming majority in the legislature. Then it went to the public for a vote. 70% of the public voted for it, and the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, sued,
yep,
and one judge overthrew it. So then out of that was born the American Laws for American Courts bill that then says, look, we want to come against any foreign law. They didn't mention Sharia by name, but it's anything foreign. And so even in Idaho, that's supposed to be a very conservative state, Republican majority, Republican governor, Republican lieutenant governor, there is a balking. Because the moment that you say anything about Islam, and this goes back to what Dick said about the purging. I think most people do not realize that the purging that has happened in law enforcement and in our elected officials, and their understanding, just like we covered last week, where
right,
on 9/11 you can't even mention Islam as a motivation. So that purging has been systematic, and I think that there's so much fear. I talked to a legislator in Idaho he was legislator in Idaho, but he was on the House side. And he was the chairman of the House, and they wanted me to come and testify. And then before I came and testify, he was like, well, you can't say anything about Muslims. You can't say anything about Islam. You can't say anything about jihad. You can't say anything, but just talk about foreign law. I go, well, okay, but which foreign law are we talking about? So those who get it, there are some good ones who really get it, but they're outnumbered and there's fear. But they must understand, and I always say this to them, whether you acknowledge it or not, the day of reckoning is coming. The day of reckoning for you is coming, that when this is then in your face, like it is in Western Europe, when, as we talked about in the program, Islam goes to the upper house and Muslims are no longer permitted to lie about their intentions. And when the Muslims will say it to your face, we will implement Sharia. Sharia is for all, not just for Muslims, but for all, as it is happening in Western Europe, particularly in Germany, particularly in the United Kingdom, in France. The day of reckoning is coming. So I think that it does not mean we don't fight the battle. There are states, as we know, I think 12 states, isn't it, that have passed American Laws for American Courts.
Pretty close to that, yeah.
Small measure, right? It's a small measure. But as long as we have fear and cowardice, and let's add one more point. How many of our elected officials, the legislators, really understand our Constitution, really understand our Bill of Rights and our form of government? How many of them will say, we are a democracy?
Right.
We are not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic based upon, as I said in the video, unchanging laws, because they're predicated upon the laws of nature and nature's God, And the laws of nature and nature's God are unchanging. And that's what they don't understand. Therefore, our courts operate by precedent. Common law, the Seventh Amendment, has been thrown completely out the window, because common law today, what's common law today? Common law today is viewed as case law. The Seventh Amendment and the founders understood common law to be predicated on the very laws of nature and nature's law, God, because it was unchanging common law. It was common to the man. No longer is it common. So this is why it's so important you're doing what you're doing.
Wow. Go ahead, Dick.
Well, Shahram, I think we want to move on to the detail, but before we do that, I'm sitting here thinking, some people might think we had a lot of conversation last week about Michigan. You talked about Minnesota. Well, if you don't live there, maybe you think this is kind of like it's not going to be applied. I think you need to realize that the legal system that we're talking about is discussed each and every day, and certainly each and every Friday in each mosque in America. There are 3,200 of them. Studies have shown that over 80% of them are heavily Sharia compliant. So this is the conversation. What we're talking about tonight is not just happening in one location in Minnesota or Michigan. It is likely in your state, in your nation, and if you have a university, certainly on your college campus at the Muslim Student Association. This is the government, the legal aspects of this are part of what is discussed in the seats of government that are called mosques, and they're all over the place. So,
well, and Dick, just really quick,
sure.
I know you guys are aware of this, is that that's a great point, because when those who think about that it's not in my area, again, the example I just gave was in Idaho. So the bias is that, well, Idaho is a conservative state, but yet Boise, Idaho, per capita is getting more refugees in the last 3 years than any other city in America, per capita, because it was a welcoming city. So now you have this massive Muslim population coming in. They establish enclaves, and what we know from Europe is once they establish enclaves, they're going to establish a Sharia court system, because it goes hand in hand. And so you guys remember, this is Center for Security Policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had done this study back in 2015. And the study was talking about the level of support for Sharia supremacy. 51% of surveyed Muslims in America, across the country, said if they had the choice between the United States Constitution and Sharia law, they would choose Sharia law. 25% said that whatever to implement Sharia law, including against unbelievers, is acceptable. I'm sorry, 20%. So over 51%, more than half, believe that they should be governed under Sharia if they had a choice, and that they also agree that Muslims should have the choice. So this is very important. And as we talk about these specific details, again, if the mentality is this is not going to happen, or it's not happening now, when we have, again, Center for Security Policy also did another study where they showed 136 court cases. By the way, when I went to Idaho, I printed this out and I gave it to legislators. I said, here are the 136 court cases broken down between family law, civil law, custody issues, monetary issues. These are, folks, just so you understand, these are cases in America where Muslims go before an American judge to adjudicate a problem, whether it's civil or criminal. And that their argument that they're taking before an American judge is that because I'm a Muslim and for example, maybe there's a custody battle. So the father says, I have a custody order from the country of Pakistan, or country of Iran, and I want this custody order to be validated here in the United States. You got to recognize it. That American judge should say, forget about it, get out of my court. But we have 136 cases, according to the Center for Security Policy study, that American judges are considering or applying foreign protection orders, foreign laws, foreign judgments upon and in an American court. Well, guess what that establishes? Precedent, case law. So anyway, sorry, Dick, I didn't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but to your point, people need to understand this is across the nation. This is not just, like you said, in Michigan, Wisconsin.
That's very, very much worth putting that out there. I think the other thing to consider is this whole notion of judges confused about their job and not living up to their oath.
Right.
And it also, unfortunately, applies to law enforcement personnel who have been trained to stand down when it comes to this topic, to not to be overly concerned. And this starts right with the Purge, the FBI, and other shows we've talked about. The FBI totally supporting sensitivity for Islam, sensitivity for the Sharia, sensitivity for those that practice Sharia, as opposed to reminding them we have a law. It is against the law to treat women that way. So let's jump back into the detail if we could. In your part two, and I'm just going to throw these out and you can comment on them, you talk about the fact that women under Sharia are actually, in some cases, cannot travel, in some cases cannot leave the home without permission. And that's part of Sharia. That's part of the detail that's in Sharia.
Exactly. Well, and this goes back to, again, adjudication by fiqh councils and over a period of 1,000 years. So when I cited the Reliance of the Traveller, you're talking about 1,000 years of Islamic case law brought into this text. And of course, there are other textbooks that can validate it, as I mentioned in the video. That's the Shafi'ah school, which is the third most conservative. Of course, the Hanbali school is the school that we get Wahhabism, right? The aspect of Salafism, the strict interpretation, the letter of the law. So the Reliance of the Traveller, ROT, says that in section M10.3 that women cannot travel. So if they're in a Sharia compliant nation or a Sharia compliant community, even within another nation, and we've seen this in Western Europe, that they cannot travel outside of this area without their husband, without written permission. If they leave home, and we saw this in Iran, when Khomeini took over and they established morality police, and they would drive around, they would have these women in the black full burqas, full niqab, driving around with military police that were of the Revolutionary Guard. And what they would do is, if they see, let's say, a man and a woman walking down the street together, they would stop them and say, is this person with you a blood relative? Meaning they have to be a husband, they have to be a brother, a cousin, son. If they're not, they can be arrested and they can be lashed. Why? Because in Reliance of the Traveller, section 10.4, it says women cannot leave home and travel without male permission and without male accompaniment of either blood relative or, of course, of their husband.
And so this, this whole male supremacy affects not just Muslim women, but non-Muslim women who are subject to rape and other things. Let's keep going if we can. Let's talk about polygamy. In part two, you have some interesting comments about polygamy. And actually, I'm going to put the topic right out there. Every 4 nights, there's an opening for intimacy with one of the wives. You want to explain that a little bit?
Well, not just that, because again, the Reliance of the Traveller is so specific, guys, in section M5.2 about one, that a Muslim man is permissible to marry up to 4 women. Mm-hmm. Now, the ironic thing is that we know that Muhammad had at least 11 wives, but of course he's special, so he always got special treatment. But the average Muslim man is allowed 4 wives. And in the Reliance of the Traveller, it recommends that they set up a schedule, I kid not, a schedule for intimacy, for sexual relations. So they make sure that they visit the bed of each wife throughout the week, at least once, on a rotating schedule to not alienate or cause temptation for the woman. And then as such, if now, can the woman have more than one? No. But
right.
In certain Islamic countries, like in Iran, they allow what's called a 1-hour marriage. Now, this is a little bit disputed because it's not orthodoxy within Islamic law, but it is permissible within certain parts of it, depending on which fiqh council or which jurisprudence you look at. And that is now, so can we figure out what a 1-hour marriage is? So the guy wants to go outside of his marriage.
It's called prostitution.
Exactly. And have a prostitute or have an affair, which we would call an affair. But he goes and first gets a marriage certificate for 1 hour to do the business, and then the marriage, of course, after the hour, the marriage certificate is nullified.
Wow.
This is the perversion. And by the way, first of all, polygamy, as we know, is outlawed in all 50 states right now.
Right.
But
And it's a felony, I believe, right?
That's right. And it is, of course, a violation of both the Declaration and the Constitution, because it's a violation of natural law, because the God of the Bible has created marriage between one man and one woman. So it's not only morally wrong, but it's legally wrong. But this is the push.
Yeah.
And one of the warnings I have for if there are any Mormons watching this program tonight is that I find it very bizarre, like in Idaho, that many in the Mormon community support and defend Muslims and their right to exercise. It's interesting that Mormons obviously have this background of polygamy. I don't know if there's a connection, but I pray that Mormons would wake up and realize that if Sharia is fully implemented, their religious freedoms also goes bye-bye.
Gone.
So these are just some of the things to think about.
So let's move on. We can begin to see male supremacy, but also some sexual perversion here. And certainly if you think women are property and you're concerned about their sexual appetite, you will cut them. And that, of course, is female genital mutilation. Why don't we address that, Shahram?
Well, it's a tough one, you guys, as you know, because this is just gruesome. It's a gruesome practice. The Quranic or the Sunnah, particularly the Sharia classification of it under Gaira law is FGC, female genital circumcision. And the idea, we would call it mutilation because we know it's mutilation. But in the terminology that Reliance of the Traveller section E4.3 uses is an Arabic term that does imply, because there's some people say, oh, it's the same as male circumcision, you're just cutting away a foreskin. No, the Arabic term is very clearly for the female body part that is meant there for pleasure, and it is the cutting off of that part, and it can start as early, we've seen, as age 6. You guys remember recently the doctors in Minnesota they were Michigan doctors. I can't remember where they were practicing. Michigan doctors in Minnesota, I think. They went across straight lines, and they were charged, and then they were, it got sued or challenged, and that one judge in Michigan threw it out because it wasn't under the Commerce Clause of all things. They were arguing.
So here's an example, though. There are states that have FGM laws, and some of the laws related in the federal government. So we've had laws for some time. This brings up the whole topic of stand down. The law enforcement have been through the people they work for, the leaders, etc., and the FBI on down. There's a stand down order for all kinds of things. Where are the indictments? Even in the new states that have new laws,
right?
We question whether anybody's really been trained. How serious are we in protecting children? How serious are we protecting women against crime? And of course, the next one that comes to mind is this whole conversation about rape of non-Muslim women. And of course, we can throw into that the whole notion of child brides, which is essentially raping of young children. So can you kind of put in perspective this whole topic of sexual attacks against, well, certainly, Muslim children, but also, frankly, non-Muslim women, precisely because they're not Muslim?
Well, very good, Dick. And just to add one thing quickly to your point about the FGM or FGC legislation, where were the feds when that judge in Michigan overthrew that case? Because it's, as you said very clearly, even though it is not against the law in all states, there are many states that have not passed it. We were trying to pass it here in Washington State. You think that it would be a cross the aisle issue, right? It should be a cross the aisle issue. You're mutilating little girls against their will. They're not of consent age. And anyway, so the liberals, it's all doublespeak, and even the middle of the squishy Republicans, I call them. But going to your point that the feds should have stepped in and said, we're going to go after these guys, and we're going to charge them under federal law because of that. But going back to child bride, so two things you're talking about here. One is the age of consent for a child bride, which is again sickening because when we talked about the Sunnah, we talk about the practice of Muhammad. And because in the Quran, Muhammad is referred to as al-insan al-kamil, the perfect man. So whatever he does, Muslims are to emulate. Well, because we know the famous story, this is in Sahih Bukhari, again, volume 5, book 58, 236. The narration by Hisham's father is that after Khadija, which was Muhammad's wealthy widow or wife, died before the Prophet departed for Medina, he had then married Aisha. And most people probably heard the story of Aisha, right? One of his 11 wives, as I said, that we know of. Well, it's very clear, both according to that testimony and to Aisha's narrative, that she was 6 years old when this man was betrothed to her under a verbal contract. And then at the age of 9, when he was 50, the marriage was sexually consummated, meaning he slept with a 9-year-old girl. Now, in this country, we would call that pedophilia. It's already against the law. We don't need to pass a law to enforce it. It's already against the law. But in Muslim countries, not so. Now, you brought the issue of slavery and rape, because the reason, Dick, we have to understand, the reason that rape of a non-Muslim is permissible under Islamic law is if two conditions. One, the area is declared Dar al-Islam. That's the key. You cannot just rape if the area is not considered Dar al-Islam. Muslims will condemn, catch this now, Muslims will condemn rape of a non-Muslim if they're living in a Dar al-Harb situation. They'll say, oh, this is wrong, we condemn it. But if they're in Dar al-Islam, meaning they've gained the upper house, and a Muslim man is raping a non-Muslim woman, the reason is because in Dar al-Islam, now non-Muslims are considered property. Remember, they're made dhimmi. Whether they know it or not, they're distinguished as dhimmi. So as dhimmi status, now that non-Muslim woman does not have equal status and is property, and according to Muhammad and his admonition, is booty. And therefore, as booty, meaning the spoils of the victory, right? Remember, they've gone to the upper house, so now there's victory. They can be treated, and it is not considered rape. Of course, we also know, by the way, side note, that in marriage, if a Muslim man wants to have sex with his wife at any point, it's not considered rape in Islamic law.
So let's continue that conversation. We have a problem called Sweden as the rape capital of the world. And it would seem to me that probably the objective scholars for Islam have probably already figured out that Sweden is in the upper house. If I heard what you just said, then direct, ongoing, unashamed, sanctioned rape of non-Muslim women is part of life in the upper house. And if I'm correct, that would account for the increase in sexual crime and rape in Western Europe. It also brings me back to what you said last week. I mean, if Michigan is 2 years or Minnesota is 2 years away from entering the upper house, which is certainly a conversation that we had last week and we could have again, but that would imply to me that, I don't know, 2023, unless something happens, women in Michigan under Sharia would be rapeable without any consequences from a Sharia perspective.
From the Muslim community. Now, of course, we still have our own laws, but from the Muslim community, you're going to see, and you're absolutely right. I mean, this is really, you're hitting the nail on the head. You're going to see, and I said this to law enforcement. This is something that I know David talks about too. Yes. And law enforcement, as a former police officer, you got to understand, we're already seeing an uptick in assaults in Minnesota already within the Little Mogadishu there in Minnesota. You see not only Somali women themselves being raped by Muslims, but also non-Muslims. There are already a number of assaults that are not being reported as such. So what's going to happen is you're going to see a massive uptick of sexual assaults. Any woman that is caught in those areas will and is subject to being assaulted and raped. Now, of course, our laws could hold them accountable, but look at what's happening in Western Europe. They get a slap on the hand when these grooming gangs, these gang rapes, they get a slap on the hand. And in my opinion, this is my opinion solely, Western governments are either turning a blind eye or they're complicit. Because from an Islamic standpoint, when we're in the upper house, the permissibility of rape allows, basically creates the environment that what they're going to say to these non-Muslim women is, if you don't want to be raped, what do you want to guess what they're going to say?
Put on a hijab. Convert
and put on a hijab. So it's a motivation to say, look, if you don't want to be and the same thing's happening, by the way, in Germany. Mm-hmm. I have very strong, lots of friends in Germany, believers there, who are telling me that, you know, when women can't even go out alone in major cities by themselves, they either have to be in a group of women or which still doesn't protect them, or with men. And they're saying that the government is turning a blind eye. And in the Islamic mindset, when Sharia fully is implemented in the upper house, your motivation for rape isn't just rape, although there is that perversion aspect of it. It's so that you put enough pressure. You don't want to be raped? Put on a hijab, convert to Islam.
It's also is it also not a statement about men being unable, the non-Muslim men being unable to protect the non-Muslim women? So it's another marker for the supremacy of Islam.
Absolutely, because what my friend in Germany says is that, where are all the good men? That line, wasn't that a song? Where are all the good men?
Yeah.
So where are all the men in Germany that should be standing up, or in the United Kingdom that should be standing up and saying, if I see one more little girl get raped, we're going to form a protective posse, and we're going to walk these girls. They should form citizen patrols in these communities, saying it is our duty to walk every girl from their house to school, from wherever, so that no Muslim animal, filthy animal, gets their hands on them and is raping little 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old girls, grooming gangs. It is beyond sickening. And anybody out there that has a daughter should be concerned about this, that this is the future. You go, well, Shahram, does every Muslim believe this? Of course not every Muslim believes this. It's not about every Muslim believes this. It's about the fact that this is the permissibility within Islamic law because of the sickness of the Prophet of Islam himself. This man was a pervert. He was a vile pervert, mass murderer, polygamist, on and on and on. And this is again, I want to emphasize, he is the perfect example. As Christians, our example is Jesus Christ. As Muslims, their example is Muhammad.
Right.
So are they acting any different? And by the way, you mentioned in Sweden, just so to give the magnitude of the numbers, by the way, can I tell you Norway is catching up to Sweden?
Yeah.
77% of all the rapes in Sweden are carried out by foreign men. Now, the statistics won't say Muslims.
Of course not.
And we know that the majority of immigrants or refugees are Muslims coming from North Africa or the Middle East. So 77%. That's why it's the rape capital of the West. And especially once they've deemed an area upper house, have you guys seen those signs they put out, say this is a Sharia controlled zone, right?
Yeah.
And so no dancing, no drinking, no alcohol, no loud music. If women are walking around, their skirts too low, or they're wearing, so they're now subject to, well, we're going to teach them a lesson.
Just a reminder, we're talking about 3,200 places in America where this is sanctioned, this conversation,
right?
Precisely that Muhammad is the perfect man. That's all you need to know. If Muhammad was this person that Shahram just explained, and he is the perfect man, and you have a person standing up in 3,200 locations every day, every week, certainly on Fridays, saying he is the perfect man, and this is his history, we have a problem, particularly when our law enforcement is standing down. I want to stay one more segment on this little piece here. We have something which I didn't really know about until recently. Apparently, adult men can have sexual relations with young boys, and that is, I think it's called pederasty, and that is part of Sharia, if I understand it right. Is that true?
It's partially true, because again, it's kind of like the issue that I mentioned earlier about the 1 hour marriage. I would not say that's orthodoxy per se. The reference there in the Quran and in the Sunnah is to the idea that when these martyrs go to heaven, it talks about young boys as flowers and pearls and things to be deflowered. And so the concept, now in practice, that's what we see. For example, in Afghanistan, we routinely see young boys raped. In Iran, they have some of the highest incidents of molestation, what we know as molestation, sexual abuse, right, of young boys. But the argument among Islamic scholars would be that, is this orthodoxy? It's an iffier one in the sense of, is it fully sanctioned, or is it more that, yes, it's happening, we turn a blind eye? So I can't say definitively in my studies that it's something that there's consensus on. And by the way, same thing with FGC, female genital circumcision. The Sharia law manual says that there's permissibility. I've heard some people say that it's mandatory.
Right.
That's not accurate. It's permissibility, meaning not everybody has to do it, but once it's done, it's condoned and permissible. So I would say the same thing about this thing with boys.
It's interesting because the FGM case in Michigan was a particular sect, Borodori. I'm going to get it wrong. Anyway, there's a collection of mosques in America that come from this Indian subcontinent.
Deobandi?
No, what's the Deobandi? That's what I almost said. This is an
Okay.
Indian sect of Muslims.
Okay.
And the reason I mention it is the imam in India, after the case had been, the indictment came on board and reminded all of his network of mosques that they do have to do FGM. So I think even when it's not 100% mandated, there's these people that promote this or that. The other comment I want to make is we've had all of this attention about the Roman Catholic Church and priests taking advantage of young boys, and there's been indictments. It's a hot topic. Where would the indictments, if there? I mean, we haven't had a single indictment I'm aware of in a Western country or in America or Canada, for that matter, on this topic of older men and younger boys. It's just a notion that these are the kind of things that are in people's heads, and we're walking around with those people and interacting with those people, and they have been indoctrinated with this culture, which is a culture really that not only is it male supremacy, it's a culture that celebrates things like death as opposed to the sanctity of life. So we're just trying to focus on these things that are realistic that could affect individual people's safety.
Can I talk about one, just before we leave women, because we're talking about women and children, one of the ones we have to mention is the incidence of under GAIRA rulings, the idea of honor killings, honor.
Yeah.
As you know, in Islam, what's called the Ummah, or the Islamic community, because Sharia comes from the idea that, again, for those of you, I mean, you guys are Sharia crime stoppers, hopefully everybody in your audience know this, but in case you don't, the word Sharia itself in the Arabic means the way or the path. Right. So when we say Sharia law, it's not Sharia law, it's Sharia law. So it's the path of Allah. Now, we know it's a legal system because if you look at for example, the Reliance of the Traveller, very important to understand, there is no separation of mosque and state. In our nation, we know that ecclesiastical or biblical law goes to a certain point where it touches civil authority. As I said in the video, civil authority is subject to higher law, but there are certain things that are ecclesiastical. So, for example, I don't want a law in America that would say that by law, we're going to force someone to convert to Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's a violation of the freedom of religion clause, that there can be no establishment in the aspect of force. In the same sense, with honor killings, now, of course, honor killings would be covered under the fact that, one, it's murder or assault. So we already have laws on the books, but it's more prevalent than people realize within the Muslim communities themselves. So in this case, it's not a threat to non-Muslims right now. It's a threat to Muslims, because young women who either leave Islam and convert to Christianity or decide that they want to be a little bit more Western. We've seen these cases. If you remember the Syed sisters, and there's many examples. The gal in New Jersey, her husband, they had a program called Bridges, of all things, TV program, and the husband beheaded her.
Right.
So this is prevalent. And then if we get a chance to talk about apostasy,
let's do that.
Yeah. See, this is my what's it when you're playing cards and you got not a full house. What's the best one that you got a straight flush or whatever it's called?
I think so, yeah.
Royal
flush.
Royal flush. This is my royal flush in the sense of my strongest argument for why Islamic law is antithetical to the United States Constitution. Because it's a very simple premise. Every other foundation that is enshrined in the Declaration and in the amendments to the Declaration, right? Every other thing and make sure, folks, if everybody out there better have one of these that they have on them, or they have, when I travel in my bag, amen. I always have, because when people say I've never read it, sometimes I get a couple extra ones. And I just say, please read it, starting with the Declaration. Too many people only read the Constitution, they don't read the Declaration. So I'm always on a mission to get them to start at the beginning, which is our birth certificate as a nation, the Declaration. So anyway, it's very important to understand that the premise of religious freedom is the main reason why we separated. It's the main reason that the forefathers left Europe and came to America for religious freedom. It's the main reason that we separated from England and declared independence, because if it was not for the Black Robe Regiment, the pastors in the pulpits that were saying that we cannot bow a knee to the monarchy, to the king, we only follow one king, and his name is King Jesus. And so where there's that proper separation, and here's what we should say is the proper separation, right? Government has no place to intrude upon the church unless the church violates a clear law of God. But the church is to be the conscience of the government. And we've lost that conscience today. So apostasy, why is this so important? Freedom of religion. So now 20 years, that video was from a couple of years back. 20 years ago, I left Islam. In America, I became an apostate according to Islam. But in America, I left, became a Christian. And to my knowledge, that I know, nobody put a fatwa on my head. Nobody tried to kill me. My family disowned me, mind you, when I told them. They disowned me. But fortunately, nobody in my family was trying to kill me. Well, today, as I travel and speak, I have death threats. That's a whole different situation. But the fundamental principle of our republic is that I can choose to follow a religion or not follow a religion. So in Islam, when it clearly teaches, both in the Quran, in the Hadith of Muhammad, and in Sharia law, that if you leave Islam, it is a death sentence guaranteed. And I don't know if we have time to go through just a couple of the verses. I don't know. Do we have time?
Sure.
Because they just got to understand this. So here it is, Sahih Bukhari again. Muhammad said, quote, a Muslim that had admitted that there is no God but Allah and that I am his prophet, meaning the Shahada, right, may not be killed except for 3 reasons. 1, punishment for murder, meaning if you kill a Muslim, not a non-Muslim, but a Muslim.
Right.
2, for adultery, particularly for if the wife committed adultery on the husband. And 3, for apostasy. So according to Muhammad, those are the only 3 conditions that is justifiable for killing someone. Now, in the Reliance of the Traveller, section 08, 1, and 2, it then goes to define that apostasy, which is called Ridda, R-I-D-D-A, which we know the early Islam fought the Ridda Wars when Muhammad died and there was a mass exodus out of Islam. It very clearly says that if someone is sane and voluntarily, like me, I was sane and I voluntarily apostatized from Islam, you must go to them and call them back to Islam. And I've had many Muslims do this with me when they find out I'm a Christian. You need to come back to Islam. If it says they do, you accept it from them, meaning they repent, they come back to Islam, I made a mistake, blah, blah, blah. If they do not, it says they must be immediately killed. I don't know if there's any ambiguity about that. So here's one more example in case people don't know that Muhammad was very much for this. Sahih Bukhari 989-271. A certain Jew accepted Islam, but then reverted to his original faith. Mu'adh saw the man with Abu Musa and said, what has this man done? Abu Musa answered, he accepted Islam, but then reverted to Judaism because he was a Jew. Remember when they went up to Yathrib, where it was heavily Jewish. Mu'adh then said, it is the verdict of Allah, meaning from the Quran, and Muhammad, meaning the Sunnah, that he be put to death, and I am not going to sit down unless you kill him. So this is, 1, a violation of natural law, 2, a violation of the First Amendment. Because here's the bottom line. This is, again, my royal flush. If you do not have the freedom to leave Islam, then Islam can never be compatible with our First Amendment. End of story.
That's it.
Right there, we should pack up the shop and go home and say, that's it. There is no greater argument. If you cannot freely leave Islam or be killed, then how can Islam ever be compatible? Now, someone said, well, Shahram, what about all these Muslims in America? What are they going to do? You're going to kick them all out? No. A Muslim can come to America and say, look, I choose to not follow Islamic law. I choose to assimilate and obey the Constitution and obey the supremacy of the Constitution. And therefore, I reject these things. Here's the problem, guys. If a Muslim does that, what happens to that person? They are no longer a Muslim.
He's an apostate.
And they're an apostate, exactly. So now they can be killed within the community. So it is a no-win situation. And this is something that Western European countries and Western nations are beginning to face. And the day of reckoning is coming, folks. They're not going to hide from this. Every elected official that wants to be cowardly and doesn't want to deal with this or thinks they're being politically correct or protecting their seat, the day of reckoning is coming. Islam is antithetical. Islam as an ideology is antithetical to our Constitution, starting with the First Amendment.
So Shahram, if I could jump in here, Dick, sorry. How do we allow Muslim candidates to be sworn in on the Quran? How does that become a legal system that they can swear to? Are they actually swearing to Sharia? Are they swearing to the Constitution as they try to claim?
Of course, look, before, when Muslims who ran for office, if they were elected at lower levels, they had to put their hand on the Bible and swear allegiance to our Constitution. Now, within Islam, it is permissible to lie about that, so they could have lied. So what do? We make it easy for them.
Sure do.
Now we say, you can put your hand on the Quran and swear your oath to office. Well, the thing is of course their allegiance, as 51% of Muslims say, is to the Sharia. So therefore, we've removed the need for them to lie. So Keith Ellison being the first one,
right,
who took his oath of office, then Andre Carson. Now we have Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and we have all of the ones at the state level. Mr. Mahmoud there in Michigan. We have all these folks at the local level, down to the Parks Commissioner.
Right.
They're now all putting their hands. So my view of that, Mary, is that is unconstitutional because of precedent. Number two, it is illegitimate. It is an illegitimate oath of office, because we know that Quran that they're holding in their hand is antithetical to any other legal system, including the United States Constitution. The Quran, according to the Muslim, just like we would say for the Bible, it's the highest law. So the Constitution does not is not supreme to that, right? Does not trump that. The Quran does. So if they're taking their oath to the Quran, that means that they are seditious to the Constitution. That's how I feel about it. Now, but plus also, it's now set a precedent.
Right.
And so we are being sabotaged from within, exactly as the Muslim Brotherhood Explanatory Memorandum says, guys, and they're doing it by our own hands. We allow them to no longer even have to lie about it.
Well, Dick, do we want to get to a Q&A now?
Let's just take 5 minutes, if we could, on one other topic that's
okay.
We could, and that would be homosexuality, which maybe treat it quickly. It's a very important topic. Shahram, can you help us sort through this?
I sure can. This is an interesting one, isn't it, guys? Because how funny that where does the Muslim community, the Islamic movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, where do they get a lot of their support from? From the left.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a left, including feminism. By the way, all the talk about women's rights, right? It's not just Linda Sarsour. If you saw the first Women's March, right? You remember when all the women were donning the hijab made of the American flag, and they were praying during the prayer times with the Muslims? Mm-hmm. I mean, talk about just foolishness. So in the same way, why does the LGBTQ transgender community defend the rights of Muslims to practice their faith? This is what they always say, right? We should have the right. Well, guess what, LGBTQ community? If Muslims have the freedom to truly practice their faith, as we see in Western Europe, where they set up the Sharia control zones, then that Muslim will come up to you in the street to say and say something derogatory about you, using derogatory terms, and say, hey, get out of here, or you're sick or a pervert. So again, within both the Quran, which is the law of Allah, both within the Hadith, particularly in Abu Dawood and other references, and in the Sharia Law Manual, ROT, section P 17.3, the Messenger of Allah, which is who? Muhammad, has said, whoever you find doing the action of the people of Lot, meaning homosexuality, execute the one who does it and the one to whom it is done. Abu Dawood also says, if a man who is not married is seized committing sodomy, he will be stoned to death. You guys remember when ISIS was throwing people off buildings?
Yep.
You know where that comes from? There is a verse in the Quran that talks about the idea of throwing sinners off a high place. But because there's a little ambiguity about can that be done to homosexuals, so what ISIS was doing was they throw them off the building, but because the hadith is very clear that they must be stoned, then they would go down and stone them, just to make sure that they were observant of Islamic law. So guys, anybody listening out there who thinks we're being bigots, that we're being unfair to Muslims, understand the LGBTQ community, if they want to practice their lifestyle, they should be supportive of our efforts to stop Sharia. Because if Sharia is imposed, it is not only ostracism for them, but it is a death sentence. And by the way, I know this firsthand because anybody can go onto the internet and search Iranian government executes homosexuals in the public streets. And you'll see a row of homosexuals on cranes hanging in the public streets from a high place.
Yep.
Well, Shahram, this is so important, but we probably have more questions than we can imagine. And Mary is going to do us a service right now if she can and try to get some of these questions across and answered. So thank you, Shahram. Let's go into the questions here.
Okay, we've got one question is, do you see Sharia eventually taking over whole states, or will that never happen?
I don't know if you could say it will happen to an entire state. Certainly when we make the argument of Michigan or Minnesota, you will see a state government, like in Washington state to some extent as well, that is complicit in it. Again, when you have the governor of Minnesota placing Mr. Jailani Hussein, who's the head of CARE, or in Michigan there with, what was that guy's name, Dawood Walid, right? When you see them getting seats at the table in the governor's transition team, you can have a state government, or in Minnesota, when you have Keith Ellison as your attorney general, or even in Michigan with Dana Nessel, who herself is, again, think about the irony. She herself is openly LGBT, right? She's a lesbian. Yep. She kissed her wife on stage on election night, and yet they support the Muslim community and their right to practice freely. So I don't think it's going to happen, meaning community by community, but certainly I can see that you're going to have a state government that's going to condone it. In the city of Seattle, we had the city council of Seattle already implementing things like, for example, Sharia financing, which is part of Sharia law, where they were giving interest-free loans for Muslims for housing. So you and I don't get that benefit because we're not Muslims. But if a Muslim cannot get a loan because it violates Sharia, they gave them these options where you can pay a fee up front but no loan and be able to get housing. So we already see implementation like that. So can a state government implement it? Absolutely. But is it going to be, are there going to be some pockets in the state? And this is why, by the way, this is why we always say, fight the battle local up. Because if you can get your county commissioners, if you can get your city council, remember Mayor Beth Van Dyne, remember her in Texas, when there was that group in Texas that wanted to establish the Sharia
courts,
the tribunal there.
Yeah.
Their city council adopted ALAC at the local level. Yeah. So when I talked to legislators, I said, listen, if you can't do it at the state level, Do it at the city council level. If you can't do it at the city council level, go to your county commissioners. Do it at the county commissioner level, because
Excellent.
we see, for example, in North Idaho next to us here, we have county commissioners that have already passed ALAC, that have imposed a ban on refugee resettlement in their county. They said, unless they're vetted, we will not accept or tolerate. And what do you need? You need courageous county commissioners. You need a courageous sheriff. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there's a recognition that there's a place that people are going to be looking to go. I happen to know some people in eastern Washington, and I guess the western part of Idaho and Montana, where the county, even though they're in two states, the leaders are cooperating with each other to try to create a contiguous area that has these enlightened laws and has an understanding that maybe in the state capital they can't get across. But this whole notion of creating, quote, I'll just say it, sanctuary place for Americans,
right,
is actually underway.
See, to Mary's question, and to the whoever asked that question, I would say that's what I anticipate, is that I think you're going to see further splitting of this nation upon not just political lines and spiritual lines, but geographically. And I think we see that even in states. Look at the issue of abortion. You have states like Illinois and New York and California that are celebrating killing babies even after the womb, and you have states like Alabama and Missouri that are almost outlawed abortion. So I think you're going to see the dichotomy. I think you have certain states that are going to go. So I don't think it's going to be nationwide. I don't think, and as long as we have a Second Amendment, speaking of amendments, as long as we have a Second Amendment that holds the government at bay, that is the check and balance of a according to the words of it, right? That you have a well-regulated militia that is there not for hunting or for sport, whatever. It's there for the protection of the right, so that you do not have a despotism form within government. America is the largest and only nation, with the exception of maybe Switzerland, that has not been fully disarmed of its citizenry. And that is a check and balance of defending these rights that we talk about on Constitution Day, because that's why there was a lawful regulated militia that would be under civil authority. So guys, folks, I encourage people, this is why go at the local level. We've had victories where school districts are trying to impose aspects of Sharia, let's say, within the school. CARE is trying to get a foothold in. Parents have gotten up. They go to the school board. They go to the city council. They fight back. We've seen victories. I think that's where we got to start, because certainly federally we don't see anything. And in some states, they're in trouble.
Yep. Excellent points. Do you have anybody in Canada that holds the same views as you do?
Many people in Canada. We did a webinar about 2 years ago with some folks up in Canada, because they're fighting the battle right now with M103. If people are not familiar with what M103 is, this is but by name, it's an anti-Islamophobia resolution that was passed by the Muslim Brotherhood version, by the Canadian Muslim Brotherhood, and the resolution specifically is to outlaw anybody that would slander Islam. This, I believe, is coming off the heels of anti-defamation laws that were in Europe. So in Canada, there is a growing movement of conservatives, of really across religious lines, meaning not just Christians, but Jews, Catholics, who are saying, listen, we better wake up soon, because the Canadian government is going to outlaw our free speech. And if you, by the way, criminalize Islamophobia, you're dimitude, because that's basically instituting slander laws under Islamic law. So yeah, there are those in Canada. I don't remember all the names right now. I know there is a Act for America. There is a fairly
chapter.
Active chapter up there. The gal there, we did the webinar with her, and there are activists up there. My friend Tom Wallace has contacts up in British Columbia. So there is a remnant that is awake of this. I know a few pastors that are very concerned about this and the infringement on their religious rights, especially when you see the LGBTQ community up there working with the Islamists. Again, foolishness. What are they doing?
Crazy.
So Canadian people keep fighting it because right now M103 is only a resolution. It's not legislation. Lord help you if it's legislation, or Lord help us in America if it becomes legislation. They're criminalizing our speech.
Yep. Mike is asking, how can we get Islam designated as an enemy threat doctrine instead of a religion? Is that even possible?
Woo, that's almost impossible given our
so.
foundation, because we protect religious freedom. And as long as Islam has religious components, I mean, let's be fair, Islam does have religious components. The idea of prayer, the idea of dietary laws, the idea of ablution, there are religious components to Islam. So I don't think the strategy is to ban ultimately, I mean, in a perfect world, you'd be able to say, yes, Islam is not a religion, but a political governmental ideology, which is what the word ikamatu din means. The commandment of Allah that Islam is totalitarian over every area of life. I think the better path is to say what must be demanded of Muslims and our elected officials who are carrying the water of the Muslim community is when a Muslim comes to America, they must assimilate. I don't have a problem. I don't know if you guys do. I don't have a problem if a Muslim wants to go in his house and pray 5 times a day, pray 20 times a day. I could care less, right? I don't even have a problem per se with the idea of a mosque unless we know that mosque, as Dick's already said, over 80% and all the ones over 70% that are connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, unless we know that those mosques are teaching Sharia supremacy, we know that they're teaching jihad and ultimately violent jihad against unbelievers. So those mosques should be investigated if the Muslim Brotherhood was to be labeled a terrorist organization. So better solution is you tell the Muslim, look, you come to America, any private accommodation to your religion, as long as it did not violate any other aspect of our laws, meaning like you can't go in your house and beat your wife. I don't, you know, even if they, look, even Dick, if they want to eat halal meat, I don't care if they want to eat halal meat. As long as when I go to Costco, I can buy non-halal lamb. I like lamb. I'm from Iran. But I can't find lamb anywhere because every bit of lamb is halal. So the moment that we allow public accommodation of Islam, we allow Muslim taxi drivers or Muslim shuttle drivers, like in Seattle, who sued Thrifty and said, you need to let us pray during the day. Sorry, I know, I'm going too long. Anyway,
no,
I
you're
have
good.
many examples.
You know, the only comment, Shahram, I would make is those 3,200 mosques need to have their doors open so people can go in and out, and people can be very freely, just like they can go into a Catholic church or a Jewish synagogue.
Right.
For them to have a fortress notion that we can't get in, we can't go in, we can't ask questions, we can't learn, that to be 3,200, quote, semi-secret fortresses is a challenge. So this whole notion of not knowing what's going on is actually terrifying.
Very troubling, very troubling. And when we know that quote unquote radicalization is happening within the mosque, law enforcement needs to understand this thing. When law enforcement has had their hands tied because they can't tie ideology to action, just like with 9/11, we know that this quote unquote, and they say radicalization, I say fundamentalization, that they're being fundamentalized within the mosque, and therefore the more they're fundamentalized, particularly if the mosque has any leanings towards, again, Hanbaliism or Salafism, that means very strict interpretation. So therefore, though, like you said, my sermons, right? Every one of my sermons is on live stream.
Right.
Anybody can tune in. I have nothing to hide. Why do we not see that in mosque? Why, as you said, is there this secrecy? So be transparent, but also we must demand Muslims, whether you're agnostic or lukewarm or you're very fundamental, assimilate. There should be no public accommodation to Islam. Every time a Muslim sues because they want Sharia accommodation to their ideology that is not given to anybody else, that's a step in dhimmitude, voluntary dhimmitude, and we're subjugating ourselves to Islam. It is no longer, in my opinion, creeping Sharia. It is now a avalanche Sharia that I think we're more seeing in the West.
Well, I've got a couple questions regarding Zuhdi Jasser and his thoughts on trying to reform Islam. Do you think that's possible?
Oh, I have a lot to say about that, but I'll try to keep it short to about 20 or 30 hours. So here's the thing. Zuhdi Jasser, I don't know. People ask me all the time, is Zuhdi sincere or not? I don't know. I can't go into his head. I can't go into his heart. They said, do you think he's being deceptive? Yes, he's being deceptive for sure. Because there's things that when he's asked tough questions about Islam, he doesn't answer them. He deflects, which is a sign of deception. But can Islam be reformed? Reform in the concept of to some sort of a tolerant version? Absolutely not. Because Islam is predicated upon one person.
Mm-hmm.
And that one person is Muhammad. Because he's the only eyewitness of the revelation of Islam. And he's, as we've already said twice, he's the perfect man. So therefore, the only way that Zuhdi Jasser or anybody can claim to reform Islam is by the idea that they will say, well, we're going to change interpretation. You can change interpretation all day long. But if the Prophet of Islam did something, you either denounce it or you don't. If you denounce it, guess what happens to Zuhdi Jasser? He becomes an apostate. That's why he will not directly denounce any clear lifestyle of Muhammad, or they'll spiritualize it. They'll say, well, that was back for the time, or it didn't mean what it means. So it's a pipe dream, and I believe that organizations need to stop giving these guys airtime. By the way, Zuhdi Jasser is a Sufi Muslim. Sufi Islam is like 0.08% of Islam. You lump that in with the Ahmadiyya group, and they're another small little cult in Islam. This is not even close to orthodoxy or majority. That's why, as Robert Spencer points out, how many Muslim reformers have themselves been executed or killed? Because once they really go down the path of reform, you have to reject abrogation, first of all. You have to.
Mm-hmm.
Then if you reject abrogation, that means everything Muhammad did post-abrogation must be condemned. Well, once you condemn Muhammad, he's the only person who got eyewitness, so he has to be a false prophet. You discredit the prophet who got the revelation. You have to discredit all the information. Therefore, the entirety of Islam collapses. So I know that was not the 2-hour or 20-hour version. It was the 8-minute version, but it's very important to understand. We got to stop going down this road. I always say the greatest reform, by the way, Islam is reforming, by the way, and I say this, it's reforming towards fundamentalism. Islam right now is under reform globally. It's reform from secularism back to fundamentalism, back to orthodoxy. That's dangerous. That's why you see the greatest persecution of Christians and Jews, perhaps in the history of the church, for sure. And so there is reform there. But in my opinion, the greatest reform for a Muslim, become a Christian.
Well, we've got a question. This is kind of interesting. If in fact Sharia were to become the law of our land, what would happen to Sarsour, Tlaib, Omar, and all of these women who are so adamantly pro-Sharia? Would there be a huge impact to them?
Yes, in the sense that, and it doesn't even need to become in the land. Once they declare the upper house, you will see the token women that they have come back to the back, and you'll see the men go in the front. Right now, they're using these women because they're trying to co-opt the LGBT. They're trying to co-opt the feminists. They're trying to co-opt the left, and because they love it, right? The whole Me Too movement. Linda Sarsour out there, the Me Too movement. It's all about women. And don't you love those billboards that says Muhammad liberated women? That is the most
outrageous,
ridiculous statement that you can ever see on a billboard. So yeah, those women right now are tokens. They're simply pawns that are strategically being used to pave the way, to soften the way. Once that happens, you will see the men come forward when they go to upper house.
Yeah. Let me see.
And by the way, Rashida Tlaib will be putting on a hijab.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Ilhan Omar already has the hijab. She's one step ahead.
That's
Linda
right.
Sarsour already, although she has all those colorful hijabs.
Yeah.
If she was in, Wahhabism, no colorful hijabs, right?
That's
you gotta
right.
have uniform color. But Rashida Tlaib will be donning hijab when they go upper house.
That is the interesting side to this. All these little pretty colorful hijabs and these young girls that are wearing, basically stretch pants and the little hijab, they would no longer.
No.
They promote the idea of Sharia, but if it truly was the upper house, they no longer are as free as they think they are.
Oh, and listen, all you got to do is just go walk around Little Mogadishu. Go walk around Cedar Riverside. When I was there in July, and it is 102 degrees, and all these Muslim women are walking around with full burqas or niqabs.
Yeah.
So, right now they're doing it because they're still in the lower house. And there's this idea that there is some permissibility in their appearance. Remember, the lie of Maruna and the lie of Kitman, the lie of appearance is part of deception in the lower house. We talk about taqiyya or taqiyya, which is the lie of conscience. But deception, that's why ISIS, for example, when they put out their dabiq, and I taught this to law enforcement, I think David probably does too. I say, look, ISIS put out a memo to all the jihadis. And they said, when you're in the West, stop looking like a jihadi. Shave your beard.
Yeah.
Don't wear the full, because you look too obvious if you're traveling about. If you're going to carry out your mission, stop looking like and blend in. So the blending in concept is permissible within the lower house, not the upper house. And so that's another thing. So that's why you'll see Sarsour wearing the colorful hijabs and the makeup, and because they're blending in. All that stuff. Again, this is the battle we have in Iran right now. The Iranian government is constantly battling with women because the women in Iran are rebelling against Islam. And you saw in January of this year, women going in the streets of Tehran and taking off their hijabs. And many of those women disappeared.
That's right. But
they're pushing back. Thank God they're pushing back on the bondage and the slavery that is Islamic law, particularly upon women. And so that's the most craziest thing about this whole thing, is how the feminists jump on board with the likes of Sarsour and Taleb and Omar and all these people. It's just like they're committing suicide and they don't even realize it.
We don't have the feminists from the 60s that used to stand out there and try to protect women and children.
Exactly.
Unbelievable.
Women and children. Exactly. Listen, I'm all for it. Let's protect women and children. Let's ban FGC. Let's ban the idea
child
like
marriages.
In Europe with the guy to the point. They got to ban hijabs.
Yeah.
Let's ban hijabs. You want to wear in private, fine. But I don't think America has the stomach for it yet. I don't think they've been down the road enough as we have, as I saw in Iran, as we warn people, because we have lived it firsthand and seen our birth countries, whether you're from Egypt or Pakistan or Iran or wherever that is in that part of the world, when we've seen our countries go through this. When I saw my mom wearing mini skirts in 1960s, and today you see what women are well, today they're pushing back, guys, as I said, but for 40 years, so this is a battle that is going to get fiercer. We gotta buckle up and get ready and continue the fight. We can't give up. And I don't believe that America will become Sharia compliant fully. I think there's going to be a breaking up before that happens. I think you're going to see pockets going one way and the other before that happens, because there's going to be too many people that are going to say, I will not subjugate my kids. I will not subjugate my 2 daughters. As long as I'm alive and breathing, I will not subjugate. I will not allow the subjugation of my 2 daughters to Sharia.
Amen. Amen. Well, that's the last of the questions for tonight. We've got to wrap this up and respect Shahram's time. So, Dick, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, Shahram, if you just hang with us a little bit, we're going to do some administrative things. Before we do that, we're going to actually do our little action item opportunity here. Let me get to that. I think that's what I want. So let's just talk about action items, which is what we try to do. I think based on what you've just heard, we would like, as an action item, for you to do this on an individual basis. Convince yourself that the Constitution is in jeopardy for all the reasons we talked about, and particularly if Donald Trump is not the president in 2020. I think that's your action item on a personal level. In addition to that, we talked a little bit last time. We're running out of time. We have 400 days to go. We would invite you to dedicate yourself to to be part of the one team that must win the 2020 fight. We're going to call the 2020 fight the 2020 fight for the Constitution.
Amen.
Yes, it's about Donald Trump. I know that, but based on what you heard tonight and on just the incredible, unique exceptionalism that is the Constitution, we're going to invite you to join the fight specifically for the Constitution. And your job is just to mobilize those that you know who believe in the Constitution, but they just don't think it's urgent. They don't think they need to come out. They didn't vote in 2016. So the action item for you, based on what you heard tonight, is to find those constitutionalists, challenge some people in your own family, and remind them how important it is to fight for the Constitution by specifically going and voting in 2020. Shahram, do you have any comments you want to add to that? Any other action items that come to mind?
Well, I would say twofold. Again, we have education and we have activism. So one is educate. If folks are not fully aware of what we just talked about tonight, they need to be well versed. Get the resources we talked about. Watch these 3 videos that you guys are going to post. Dr. Bill Warner's that little booklet on Sharia law for non-Muslims. These are basic things. But to your activism, again, I go back to what Jim Simpson said last week, that 40 million evangelicals are not voting. That's a huge action item. So I just would echo what Dick just said. In your family, in your church, have those conversations. That 2020 will be a fight, folks. We are on the verge of socialism. And if socialism is implemented, the constitutional republic that we have for 239 years, what'd you guys say now? Well, where are we at?
232 years.
32 years from the, well, I always go back to the Declaration, but if you go from the signing of the Constitution, so 232 years, the longest running republic in the history of the world. Think about that. The longest running republic. The hand of providence. One of the things I love about the founders and many of the influencers, if they were not a founding father in the sense of signing, was that they understood the hand of providence, that God's hand was upon this nation. So there's so much on the line. That activism to say, exactly, you're voting for the Constitution, not just a candidate. That's a great action item.
Well, let's keep working on that. Let's keep in mind that part of the Constitution is the way we change power. We move from person A to person B. We do it under the Constitution. We don't do it with violence. Sarah Lopez talked about that last Tuesday night. So we have a lot at stake, and we're going to work on the education piece because we're going to bring you people every Tuesday night. Like our guest next week is Alex Newman. He's going to talk about rescuing our children and saving our freedom. Part under assault are our own children. And that should be really interesting. We invite you to join us. On October the 1st, we have Elizabeth Savage-Wolf, who will give us kind of a European perspective on this. She personally knows that if you offend Muslims, you're in big trouble. Muslims' right not to be offended takes precedence over freedom of speech. Trevor Loudon, for some of us, he started this whole thing for us with the agenda, etc. He will be on talking specifically about the risk we have in terms of the socialists and the Marxists mobilizing voters against Trump. He has the specifics. He'll talk about something called Freedom Road and aspects of communist China that are deeply involved in our own election, which most people don't know about. And then we're going to have, there we go. The 15th and 22nd of October, we'll have 2 back-to-back sessions on Sharia in schools with David Boris, retired police chief, and the reason we do what we do, he is our co-founder for Sharia Crime Stoppers, so he'll be with us at that point. We have a change in the radio program. We'll just keep you posted on that. Just a couple more minutes. There is an ongoing program continuing what we started with Sharia Crime Stoppers Action Line. It's called Islam in Focus. It is a Friday. It is a noontime activity. So excuse me 1 second. I didn't need to do that. Go back and share again. So here we go. Yeah, we have a new host, Andrew Harrod. He'll be kicking that off this Friday. John Zmirak is his guest. Specific topic is Pope Francis' outreach to Islam. And Shahram, let's think about this for just a second. Part of our problem with the Constitution and the threat of Islam against the Constitution is that Islam is embraced by a large percentage of Americans because they're followers not just of Jesus, but their allegiance is to the Pope. And Pope Francis is clearly on the side of Marxists, and therefore he is antithetical to parts of our own Constitution. So when he embraces Islam, the topic of this Friday's show, it's another concern, another threat to the Constitution.
Dick, absolutely. And again, remember, that's why we got shut down in Michigan, because that's what we were going to expose, right? We were going to expose the entire interfaith movement and their agenda, including, again, the fact that even some Catholic bishops are deeply troubled by the Pope signing the document on human fraternity back in February with, of all people, the head of Al-Azhar University, Abdul Al-Tayeb. And so this is very troubling when you have, like you said, a Marxist Pope who is espousing socialism, Marxism, then siding with Islam, which we know is, again, that red-green axis, and then trying to normalize Islam as another religion. So are those individuals that are going to side with the Pope, are they going to be in our camp to say Islam is ideologically a threat to the Constitution? Of course not. Because if they're going to say Islam is just another religion, and in fact, it's not just another religion, but it's tied into Judaism and Christianity through the Abrahamic faith, then for sure they're going to be against us and believe that we're simply, defaming Islam or whatever. So that this is very important. You got to expose interfaith and expose these actions of the Pope in order to wake people up and then bring them on the side of, this is why we have to protect our Constitution, our nation, and our republic.
So we'd invite you to definitely check out this new time. Remember, the guest is very, very, I believe as a Catholic and is very focused. There's a lot of really good Catholics that are very, very concerned. That's why we did our program, Enemies Within the Catholic Church, in the spring. And of course, we had Liz Ure and other Catholics speaking out against their own Pope for his political activity. So,
Dick, if I could jump in real quick, we did have a question. That's noon Eastern time.
Thank you. Yes.
Noon Eastern time.
Noon Eastern time. Excellent. So give a listen to Andrew Herod every week at noon. Again, we really can't thank you enough, Shahram, for being with us, and for all of our listeners that have stayed with us this whole time. We do believe it's World War III. We are one team preparing for the 2020 fight for the Constitution. Shahram Hadian, we can't thank you enough. You have a clarity, you have a standing, you have a background that we don't think anybody else has. We will invite you as many times as we can, and you've been so gracious to give us all this time.
And please, if I could just add one final comment on this, please go out to tillproject.com and order those is it 3 DVDs on
one DVD.
One DVD.
Islam's Assault on the Constitution, 2.5 hours of content. But if they want to go to YouTube, they can watch the 3-part.
3 different parts.
We'll put the link in the email as well. Plus, also, I would recommend that they do get, if they do not have that little booklet on Sharia law manual, or on the booklet on Sharia law for non-Muslims.
Yeah.
Good one to start too. And so, guys, thank you for having me. It's always a blessing to have this opportunity to be with you. Thank you guys for what you're doing. Folks all out there who are watching this tonight, thank you for your activism, for your heart for this nation. And as someone who wasn't born here, but had the privilege of coming to this nation, I had to flee my birth country. I had to flee Islam taking over my birth country and imposing Sharia in Iran. Folks, many of us understand America in many ways is the last stand. So let's pray and beseech God to give us more time, to give us a reprieve, the continued reprieve, so we have time to see if we can somehow come back to him as a nation. And so God bless you all, and let's keep the fight for this republic as long as we can keep it, as long as we can hang on to it. It's worth hanging on to.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. We're just going to remind you this is a production of the United West, and if you feel so, we'd be happy to have you contribute to our ongoing success. We are committed to webinars throughout the fall and into next year. So we want to thank you for your attendance. Thank you, Shahram, and thank you, Mary, and we'll say good night.
Good night.
Good night.